Well, there is a lot happening across the nation when it comes to policing in America and also violent crime. Here to talk to us more about that is the former Detroit Police Chief Ralph Gabi, who's also now the Chief of Staff at Triumph Church. I still call you Chief from time to time.
I cannot shake the title, Andre, so I'm good with that.
Thanks for joining us. First, let's go a little bit back because for some people, they're still getting to know that you're now with Triumph Church.
Yes.
And you're still continuing ministry. You had your own church at one time. But talk to me about what life is like for you now, because we see you on the airwaves weighing in about the important issues of the day, but also it's an inspiring and empowering message that you give throughout the week, and especially on the big day, Sunday itself. So let's bring us up to speed.
Andre, I'm extremely blessed to be under a tremendous pastor, and Pastor Solomon W. Kinlock Jr. He just is such a visionary, and his people-centric approach towards ministry is just something that resonates with me. Because, you know, a lot of people ask, well, you know, you went from police work to ministry, but police work in its essence, it really is a ministry. It's a service type of thing. If you do it the right way, it's about service. So for me, it's been a natural transition, and Pastor Kinlock has just been a tremendous mentor, friend, comrade, and to watch what he's been able to do throughout the pandemic, when other churches have been closing down and, you know, struggling to figure out how they're going to make ends meet. He engaged that much more, feeding the community. He was the one that really was the spark towards the corporate community coming on board to start offering laptops and hotspots. Pastor Kinlock went to the church and said, look, we've got to help bridge the digital divide. All these things are closing, but our children don't have the same advantages as other children. And I mean, just solicited, and the church stepped up big with $1 million of laptops and hotspots. And he doesn't wait to see who's going to do anything else. He is very, very deliberate and intentional in telling us that our theology ought to impact our sociology. So if your theology does not translate into helping the very community that you service, it really is not a meaningful ministry. So to serve as Chief of Staff and to, you know, be front and center with Pastor Kinlock and First Lady Kinlock and the Triumph leadership team, and really leading that effort. And it is just, and that's not the Sunday morning stuff. I mean, the service is expiring. The type of
well, I want to get into the service because, and first, our condolences go out to Pastor Kinlock's mother, who recently passed. But over the COVID period, you guys also had a drive-in session for church. Now I'm like, you got a big parking lot, and people tune in through their car radio,
through the car, just like if you were to go to the Fort Wyoming.
We
have an FM frequency. You tune into the FM.
I think everyone has been creative during this period, right?
Yeah, so it's, you know, but his innovation, his tenacity, his drive to make sure that at the end of the day, regardless of what obstacles come up, the church has an obligation. And he takes that extremely seriously. And, you know, what you see is what you get with Pastor Kinlock. He's the same in front of the camera, on the stage, behind the camera. It's the same drive and focus. And it's refreshing. It really is, to see a pastor that really is that focused on people.
I had an opportunity to attend a couple of times, and I tell you, each and every time, it's definitely programmed to a degree. But I think you would say it's people focused, because it definitely starts on time, and it sort of, you know, it gets you in and out. You get the message.
You know, we're very, very much sticklers for starting on time and ending when we say we're going to end. And there's a purpose behind that. We compete with so many different things now, from keeping people's attention. When I was growing up, Andre, and going to church on Sunday, there was nothing but church. You had Channel 2, Channel 4, Channel 7, and 2 UHF channels. But now you have people with, you know, hundreds of choices, sports. I mean, just so many things you can be. The internet,
the social media,
so many
attention span is
very short. It's short. And Pastor Kinlock has been very, very adept at understanding the people that we're responsible for serving and making the adjustments without compromising the gospel at all. I mean, you get full church service. I mean, literally thousands of people have joined during the pandemic, and now they're joining online, which has given us another dimension to ministry. And it has just been an amazing time for me to be a part of a ministry where, I'll be totally honest, I've been a licensed minister and ordained over 20 years, but I have never been this on fire for ministry than I have since I've been a member of Triumph Church. And people wonder what's the secret sauce. It's people, and making people the priority. It's not pulpit centered. You don't have a egomaniac who's the pastor who wants all the attention on him. It really is about how do we serve God's people.
Yeah, and coming up, I want to talk more about how the church, not just Triumph, but just in general, can do more to bridge the divide in the community and make that connection. Because there's a lot that's happening on the forefront, all across this nation, rather, in our communities where violent crime is surging. There is a divide or a distant relationship in some communities as it relates to the black community and the police.
Yes,
so let's talk a little bit about that, because you've been outspoken, and certainly you have, because you have some perspective and expertise as being the former police chief here in Detroit some time ago. Efforts to defund police departments. We've heard that rhetoric for quite some time, especially over the past year, given the death of George Floyd. Where do you stand on it? Because you've been very public about defunding the police. I actually hear your words. Police departments need to be dismantled and start all over. And I want to get into that more in just a moment. But what do you mean by that?
Well, everything is about context. And unfortunately, the ultra-conservatives have taken hold of the defund portion without the context of what the people are talking about. If you look at the history of policing, policing started with slave patrols. The first organized police departments in the United States of America were slave patrols. And ostensibly, their function was to control black and brown people through fear, violence, and intimidation. That is the fundamental basis by which policing started in America. And if you fast forward to now, you go through the Emancipation Proclamation, you go through Juneteenth, you go to the Jim Crow era, you look at the Civil Rights effort and the Civil Rights Act, you fast forward to Rodney King, you fast forward again to George Floyd, and ostensibly the form and function of policing has been controlling black and brown behavior through fear, violence, and intimidation. There are two forms of policing in America. Affluent white communities, which the wealth gap is still a tremendous issue towards equity in the United States. Those communities are not judged to be safe or perceived to be safe because you see police officers walking up and down the street all the time, because you see red and blue lights and people pulled over and people being patted down and frisked. That's not why you feel safe in Grosse Pointe or West Bloomfield Hills. You see manicured lawns. You see a housing stock that is well maintained. You see a school system that is well funded. You see parks that are manicured and kept up for the residents. You see residents with shopping alternatives. You don't have food deserts. So all of the socioeconomic disadvantages that go back to slavery, and I heard a Republican potential candidate for governor mentioned yesterday that he's not for us being victims. And I beg to disagree with that point of view. I think in spite of the challenges that blacks have had in this country, in spite of the social structures, in spite of the structural racism that we face, we have done marvelous jobs to overcome that. Some have done better than others, but that's not an excuse to call everybody else that we're falling prey to being victims.
Well, I want to get into that in just a moment, and I know you're talking about former Detroit Police Chief James Craig.
I didn't say any names.
But we'll let the record reflect, and we'll get to James Craig in just a moment. But because you made some public comments over the airwaves, and even when I spoke with you a few weeks back, you talked about dismantling police. I know you talk about also looking at things in bigger context. But your words recently on MSNBC were to defund, deconstruct, and rebuild it from scratch.
Yes.
When people hear defund and dismantle the police department, they take away their own perspective for what that really means. So, you know, you can have someone who perhaps just chanted Black Lives Matter last week, but then when they're really in an emergency and they need help,
they
call
call
911.
Absolutely.
Is the operator going to tell them, well, this police department has been dismantled? What does that mean?
And I think that's where we dumb down the conversation. Not you. I know you're reflecting what the conversation is, but it's not a principle that has not been tried. Camden, New Jersey, under a very innovative chief, Scott Thompson, early in the 2000s to close to 2010, they were a police department that was so structurally dysfunctional, so corrupt, that they physically defunded that police department. They were able to avoid police unions. They were able to avoid some very onerous contracts, and then reconstitute a police department that was reflective of the community that it served. Started with a different fundamental foundation. I think last year, Camden, New Jersey had 0 police officer involved fatality shootings in their community. That's a remarkable leap from where they were. So when we talk about defunding, it's not from the standpoint of we don't need police. No sane, rational person says we don't need police.
Well,
Now there are people that argue that.
Well,
that's not my position.
And I think that it's important for you to make that clarity, because there are profound liberal or people in the public sphere. That believe that we don't need police at all.
We
don't need police at all. So I want to give you the opportunity to
and
make that
balance.
clarification.
There's a balance, and I will make that clarification.
I think there's always a balance, because I think you get people who make knee-jerk reactions and statements after a situation unfolds, like a George Floyd or whatever the situation may be, and then there is rhetoric that is put out that demonizes, for some people who are actually good officers, and it demoralizes.
But
them.
I have to challenge the good officer piece from this standpoint. There are tremendous police officers across the country that they put it on the line every day. Some of them have paid the ultimate price. I have buried far too many officers. I've been to too many officer funerals not to appreciate and understand that. I put my life on the line for 27 years of my life serving in the capacity of a police officer. But good police officers don't stand by and watch bad police officers make it bad for everybody else. And there's a part of the culture that we've got to shake loose of, that this thin blue line. We saw it crack in the George Floyd trial. I digress. The Derek Chauvin trial. George Floyd was the victim, where you saw police officers say, "This is not what we do. This is not what we're trained for." But that is not the norm. That's an outlier. We've got to get to a point where that's the norm. In medicine, we don't expect a horrific surgeon that has violated every part of the Hippocratic Oath to be supported by other surgeons and band together to protect that surgeon. That's why the limited immunity piece is so important. Doctors have to be held accountable for their individual deliberations on how they handle a patient. They have malpractice insurance. They can have their license removed. Lawyers, the same way. We cannot allow police officers who have arguably the most critical constitutional charge of anybody in government from this standpoint. The United States Supreme Court cannot. The President of the United States cannot. The Congress cannot. Local elected officials cannot, on a dime, make a decision to take someone's life and have it justified under the color of law.
Well, I think it's interesting that you point out limited immunity, because I wanted to get to qualified immunity and that issue being debated. Should police continue to have this
qualified immunity
protection, which some will argue is leading to a rise in police resignations, retirements. Will officers?
I would beg to differ. If I could just interject there very quickly.
Will officers now hesitate to be proactive when it comes to policing if they feel like they don't have the protection and support?
I frame that slightly differently.
Okay.
If there are officers that feel like they cannot do their job without the ability to abuse the rights of black people and to take shortcuts and to take constitutional shortcuts, then yeah, a lot of people that come into law enforcement for the wrong reason, they don't want the job. A lot of people that have gotten used to conducting business in a certain way that does not regard equity and policing in black and brown communities, when you take that tool away from them, you give them scrutiny, yes, they do not want to have that job. And those are not the people that we want to be police officers. So if that's a demotivating factor, that you cannot kill a black or brown person with impunity, because look at how Dylan Roof was treated after murdering 9 people.
In the Burger King treatment.
And then, he's arrested without incident when we know he killed people. It was not speculation. He had not been proven to do so in a court of law, but every objective, reasonable piece of evidence showed that he was the culprit, and they found a way to bring him into custody. So when we look at that and we look at the backdrop of the number, and this is not anecdotal anymore, we have verifiable evidence, video evidence. The young lady that took the video of George Floyd and his murder by Derek Chauvin, absent that video, I don't think we'd be having the same conversation right now.
We talked about balance earlier, and you just mentioned objective, right? Because I think that is sometimes what is missing out of these conversations when we talk about policing in this country. Certainly, there are the bad apples, but certainly there are officers or departments that try to aim to be constitutional. Recently, President Biden made remarks, and some would say, well, are we now refunding the police because now police departments, or at least cities, have been given the permission to be able to tap into COVID funds to address policing concerns in their cities. When we've had a lot of rhetoric of demeaning the profession of police officers over the past year or so, are we missing that balance to be objective when it comes to certain instances?
I don't think so. And the reason why I don't think so is because the hue and cry for equity in policing is not a new phenomenon. We keep having the same conversation over and over in different ways. And this conversation has gone on for 50 to 60 years relative to how police interact with black and brown communities.
And I make that point because everyone's talking about, well, should we now refund the police after we're seeing these rise in violent crimes over the past few months? We're seeing it after this 4th of July weekend in Chicago and LA and New York. And I'll get to what New York is doing in just a moment, but the balance and objectiveness when we talk about this conversation.
If I could parse that a little bit, because you have to be very careful in looking at year-to-year crime increases in a vacuum. Since 1993 up till 2019, violent crime in the United States of America has dropped precipitously, like close to 70% drop in violent crime, 50 to 65% drop in property crime. So if you look year to year, yes, violent crime is higher than last year. That's unequivocal. But you also have to balance the fact that for almost a year, people were locked inside. Nothing was open. So your crime numbers are definitely going to drop in its initial phases, and if you look at the first 3 to 6 months of the pandemic, when everything was shut down, crime started to go down precipitously. Now, there were some crimes that went unreported, probably because you had abusers locked in with family members. You had children that, when you had mandatory reporting requirements when they were in school, you don't have mandatory reporting requirements when they're at home. So those are the different nuances to the crime issue. And what scares me is that we take these bite-sized one-year looks at crime and we keep reinvesting and hiring more officers, and we still never get to fundamental root causes. So if I could just give this analogy. So if I can give this analogy, as we looked at the pandemic, of course we needed to reinforce our doctors, our nurses, our medical industry. We had to fund things that we ordinarily would not have to fund at higher levels. But that was only a tactical decision to get you through the pandemic. but the real focus was finding a cure. So what we continue to do in policing is we keep funding police and we don't fund cures. Mental health helps. We don't fund job training programs. We don't fund appropriately our education from an equitable standpoint and how we fund public education versus other institutions. So if you don't start to balance the playing field there, and every time your only solution is put more money in the police departments, you're still not addressing root causes. Joanne Watson said this when I was chief of police, and she would tell me this at the table, former city council member. She said, Chief, the best crime prevention tool is a job. And if you look at it's still in the inner city of Detroit. I'm not talking about downtown. I'm not talking about this wonderful area we sit in right now, which is beautiful. It is appealing. But Mack and Beatwick is still classically Mack and Beatwick. Linwood and Philadelphia, the problems on Linwood and Philadelphia are still the same. Joy Road. I mean, you can go through a number of different neighborhoods in Detroit, and structurally, the things that have been disadvantaged to black and brown people still have not been addressed in a meaningful way. And that hasn't been addressed by Democrats or Republicans, to be completely honest. So so when you talk about defunding, it really is a reallocation. What do you do on the front end to make sure that you don't need as many police on the back end? So you have to come at it two ways. Tactically, yes, you've got to fund enforcement because it's going to take a strategic plan, a black urban agenda that deals with some of the structural issues that blacks have towards getting equity in communities. If you don't deal with those, you're just going through a cycle all over again.
But can't you just do the same? Can you do both at the same time?
Yes, you can.
And
but it has to be done with intentionality.
But I think that's the point that's missing because, it's, you're doing one without the other, or you have to go without law enforcement to be able to support the proactive things in the, on the front end. And I think that's what's lost in the conversation.
I think it has to be nuanced and with intentionality. So short term, you may need more police officers because of the volume of crime. But if you still don't address the root cause issues, at some point you're just doing the same thing the same way and expecting a different result. And this is another reason why Pastor Kinloch is a leader that I can follow, because he has been very intentional about talking about where is the black urban agenda? Where is the agenda? Not the downtown agenda, not even the Detroit agenda from the standpoint of new houses and new jobs. Because structurally, if you don't have appropriate job training, structurally, if you don't have mental health support, structurally, if you don't have adequate feeding programs and those things, Head Start, those things that are demonstrated to put people on the right track.
I want to hit 3 quick points very briefly, because I'm always interested in one's perspective and their leadership. You had your own leadership style when you was the chief of police here in Detroit. Former Detroit Police Chief James Craig recently retired and announced that he is a Republican and may seek, from what we hear, a run for governor, but he has yet to announce. But recently he made remarks that he certainly is touting that in the city of Detroit there was no looting, no fires during the protests all 2020 after George Floyd situation. And now he made these remarks that, we need to start defending our police, not defunding them. I know you've had a breadth of perspective about defund, but what do you think about his comments there?
Well, first of all, let me be completely clear. I think Chief Craig did a tremendous job as chief of police. I think he brought a ton of experience, intellect, innovation to the job. And I never look at a successor as a competitor. I think we build on each other's successes. So let me be first and foremost to tell everybody I thought Chief James Craig was an excellent chief of police. Politically, we just have to agree to disagree, because I think that is a very, very myopic, narrow point of view that he's taking, and that the conservatives have taken to the far right relative to the standing and station that black and brown people have in this country. And, Dr. Martin Luther King said it is a cruel thing to tell somebody to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps when you haven't supplied them with boots. And I'm paraphrasing. And ostensibly, that's what we're hearing in the rhetoric of the Republican Party, that the opportunity is there, go get it. And if you look at the wealth gap, a white family has 10 times the average wealth of a black family. And social demographers and economists have said that if we stay in this vein that we're in, it would take hundreds of years for black and brown people to make up that gap. If you look at Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the wealth that they were robbed of generationally that has not been made up for, no fault of their own. Because again, you say, hey, do for yourself. We did for ourselves. And Tulsa is just an example of hundreds of black communities that were disenfranchised. Where we sit right now is not far from I-75, 375, which took out Black Bottom, which had its own hotels, had its own grocers, had its own pharmacies. We had those things, and structurally, which if you look at critical race theory, it talks about how that laws and how they were formed that structurally continue to disadvantage black people in a way that if you don't understand it, you continue to reinforce things that will never allow us to have equity in how we address things in our society.
I want to get into a greater conversation with that another time, but very briefly about Chief White, Interim Chief White, who's now there. You talked about police chiefs growing or learning from or building upon each other. What do you think about his take on mental health? He wants to be able to service and support officers in that route, focusing more on mental health and his background in mental health. What do you think?
I think, first of all, let me say I applaud Mayor Duggan's selection of Chief White as the interim chief. Chief White is an extremely competent professional. He has an appreciation for community relations. He has a steep history in that. He was one of my principal deputies when I was chief, when we were in the throes of 2 federal consent judgments. When I took over that process, we went from 20% compliance to 90% compliance before it was handed off to Chief Craig, and then they got across the finish line. James White was integral in that piece. So he understands constitutional policing. The significance of his mental health background is something that we don't talk about, is the stress and trauma that police officers are under. Because a lot of the aberrant behavior, a lot of the quick trigger finger type of things that we see, some of those are a result of unresolved trauma and stress. So I'll give this by way as an example. I spent 25 years with the Detroit Police Department. The only psychological exam I took was to get on the job. No psych evaluation or anything after that. Now, obviously, if there are situations that are very newsworthy, loss of a police officer in the line of duty, your partner, officers will get help from that. But otherwise, it's somewhat voluntary or for cause. And we have to normalize mental health helps for officers because there's a lot of unresolved trauma. And that goes for the same for the black community relative to its relationship with police officers.
Or what officers are responding to, the scenes they're responding to, and the people who that they're, unfortunate situations that they're.
I mean, Andre, as a police commander, I remember a deputy chief responding to a suicide scene, and the person hung themselves. So when I was taken into the scene to see, the scene that was preserved, it was a young lady that I knew.
Wow.
I had mentored. Her mother had asked me to help with her. She, had some issues as a teenager. That was tremendously scarring to me. And that's just one of literally thousands of examples I can give that you have officers across this country that have PTSD that's been untreated.
God, but we can go on and have this conversation. But finally, I wanted you to make this point about what can the faith community do more to bridge this gap of the tensions that we have between law enforcement and the black community, and also violent crime in our city? Because in Detroit in particular, you have a church almost on every corner. But what difference is the faith community making to be able to grab a hold to young people who are committing violent acts of crime? How can it be more of a greater use for our community?
Well, I would start off by saying this. I think if you think it's bad now, If we didn't have the faith community we have, it would be exponentially worse. However, we still have a lot to do from a faith-based standpoint. We have to be much more outwardly focused on providing services and not waiting for the government to fix everything. Because in our congregations alone, we have people that have housing needs. We have people that have, food deserts and shortages of food. So there's so many things that we can do inside the walls of the church, but also we have to be more outwardly focused as well. And we really have to roll up our sleeves and get engaged with our communities.
Yeah. I think COVID taught us that.
COVID taught us that, absolutely. No, because we couldn't physically do it inside the building.
Right.
And surreptitiously, I think the global church, it forced us to really be the church that we espouse to be on Sunday mornings. We had to be it on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, which is the Triumph model. But I think all of us collectively had to do the same thing. So we have to be advocates. And I will say this, our faith leaders have to stop choosing political sides and start choosing right. Because we can't be cheerleaders and we can't wear the jersey of Republican or Democrat. But I think it's more important for us to be referees and call balls, and strikes. And those areas where Republicans have things that are beneficial to our communities and we have ethical leadership in those positions, we need to support people that are ethical, that are going to keep their word, and then we have to hold them to task. I'm not suggesting that nobody become a member of a political party. However, I think we have to be less partisan. And for me as a pastor, I try to be nonpartisan and really look at the issue and what's best for my people. Unfortunately, we don't have two parties that are living up to that right now. So most of my effort has been towards Democratic causes because they seem to be more attuned to the needs of blacks. But the Democrats have to step up as well.
Yeah. Ralph Garvey, it's a whole lot we could talk to you about. We can keep this conversation going. Chief of Staff for Triumph Church, former Detroit Police Chief in Detroit. Thank you so much for stopping by. Studio 1452. It's been great talking to you. Yeah. And you can find this story much more at MichiganChronicle.com. I'm digital anchor Andre Ash.